I lost the best friend.
Who's
Practically a brother. And I'm here to use my voice because I know he can.
It doesn't make sense. Fix it. It should have been one school shooting, and we should have fixed it.
And I'm pissed.
Because my daughter I'm not going to see again. She's not here. She's not here. I mean, amazing emotion. And now the fight for solutions. Let's bring in our panel. Byron York, chief political correspondent of the Washington Examiner. Amy Walter, national editor for the Cook Political Report. And Jonathan Swan, national political reporter for Axios. Byron, I was struck by just, first of all, the whole event and the fact that we were listening in on this exchange. It did cover all sides. It clearly was not one side or the other. It reminded me of that cabinet meeting where you saw the open exchange of lawmakers, but this had the added emotional factor of parents who had just lost a loved one this past week.
It did, and the president did a good thing by simply letting these people tell their stories. There were a whole variety of suggestions, or a whole variety of experiences that people had with violence, and I think the president clearly wants to be seen as getting ahead of this issue, of actually considering taking some action on this. That's why he did this today. That's why he did the bump stock thing yesterday. I'm not sure he actually has the authority to do that, but he did it anyway. And what remains to be seen, though, is what exactly would he be behind in terms of what action. He seems clearly to be in favor of, or thinking about favoring raising the age for buying a long gun to 21, as it is for a handgun, to some sort of enhanced background checks. But the question, I think, a big debate will be about assault weapons. That's always what this comes down to.
Yeah, the president tweeting on background checks last night, whether we are Republican or Democrat, we must now focus on strengthening background checks. He also listened to one father's solution today.
One possible solution, which may not be very popular, would be to have people in the school, teachers, administrators, who have volunteered to have a firearm safely locked in the classroom, who are given training throughout the year, have them raise their hands to volunteer for the training, and when something like this starts, the first responders are already on campus.
You know, there was some pushback in that room, Amy, about that. Right. We are now learning tonight, just moments ago, that armed sheriff's deputies are going to be patrolling the area around the school down there where this incident happened as of tomorrow or this week.
Well, this is always the challenge on an issue like this, and as we saw even on immigration, where if you ask the broad question, do you support background checks, you get almost universal support. Do you support allowing these DACA recipients to stay in the country? Almost universal support. But then you get into the details of this, which is if there were just a bill simply that talked about background checks with nothing else added, if Republicans added on something about allowing teachers or other volunteers to be armed, there was in another bill this idea that Republicans had too about a concealed carry issue. That is going to destroy any ability to get Democrats on board. If Democrats push too far on limiting access to assault rifles, that's going to push it. Nobody seems capable of simply saying, we're going to solve this one problem. We're not going to solve all of it. We're going to just be able to do this one thing, pass it, and start it.
You know what was compelling, I thought, on the argument for arming people inside the school, whether it's teachers or some trained person, like an air marshal that you don't know is in there, was the father who lost the daughter, who said after 9/11 we figured it out. We as a country changed things and we figured it out. But after Columbine, we didn't figure it out. And school shooting after school shooting, we haven't figured it out.
It's because the left and the right have different ideas about what gun control means. And there was this debate in the 90s, early 90s, you know, if you talk to Grover Norquist about it, he'll tell you chapter and verse, where the left was saying we want a list of everyone who owns a gun. And the right was saying, no, we want a list of the bad people that we want to prevent from having guns. And then now it's the same debate. It's the left wants to reduce the number of firearms in this country and put limits on them, and the right wants more security. And again, there's very little overlap on this issue, particularly when it comes to something like arming people in schools. This is something that the president instinctively is actually in favor of, arming people in schools.
Clearly he was not.
But he's also all over the map. He's privately saying, and Byron's right, and we've reported it, you know, kids shouldn't be allowed to have guns. We should raise the age to 21. That's never going to fly. It's never going to fly with the NRA. They've put out a statement in favor.
Even if he's pushing it and gets the NRA to the table and says, listen, we got to do something.
They will never support that. And if he got right behind that, he could get 60 votes probably in the Senate with Democrats and maybe some squishes. But you ain't getting that thing through the House.
Speaking of the House, here's Nancy Pelosi and Paul Ryan on the background check bill.
All we've been asking to the Speaker is to give us a vote. We believe there is bipartisan support for improving the background check bill.
We had hearings on the gaps in the instant check system, and those hearings led to a conclusion that there were gaps that need to be fixed, and that led to legislation that has now passed the House. We passed legislation cleaning up the instant check background check system. That bill, with others, is sitting over the United States Senate.
All right, Byron, so I guess there's a lot of emotion here. There's a lot of passion. It does seem like it's a different conversation. But in reality, what are we going to see?
I don't know if it really is a different conversation. I mean, Trump has to set himself apart from this dysfunctional history of this. I mean, personally, looking at it, if they didn't do anything after Newtown, I mean, someone went in and murdered 20 first graders. They didn't do anything after Newtown. How are they going to do anything now?
Because you have a Republican president who has the backing of the NRA, who could be a Nixon in China on the issue of guns.
After Newtown, there was a vote on banning assault weapons. Democrats controlled the Senate 55-45. 16 Democrats voted against it. There was a bipartisan consensus. Not sure that has completely changed, even on bump stocks after Las Vegas. And even when the NRA gave them permission to do something about bump stocks, they didn't do it.
All right, Quinnipiac, the poll, gun control options, required background checks, support. You see these numbers in these polls, mandatory waiting period for gun purchases, nationwide assault weapons ban. I mean, we saw the reaction from the Clinton assault weapons ban, and their own Justice Department kind of listed why that didn't work then, stopping school shootings. As an electoral issue, is this going to drive the day?
That is really an interesting question, given the emotionality around this, but also the activism by younger voters. Is this going to activate those young voters who traditionally sit out midterm elections? It's really unclear. One thing we do know, just historically, is people who own guns tend to be much more passionate and engaged politically on the issue than people who don't own guns. It's almost a 2-to-1 difference. People who say they called their member of Congress to talk about this issue, or they've tweeted about it or engaged somehow about it. Are we going to see a change now on the other side, and where? And we don't know that yet.
So have we ever, I mean, I don't know the answer to this question, you probably do, and you're probably one of the only people who does, has there ever been a candidate who has won an election on a gun control message, that was the decisive factor that got them over the line?
There was a New York Congress race, what was her name?
Yeah, on Long Island.
Anyway,
yes.
but it'll come to me, but at least I got that.
Very good.
It begins with an M.
Carolyn
Mahoney. McCarthy.
Excellent.
Right,
excellent.
I'm not going to tell you that they told it in my ear, but I'm going to say that I was really smart.
Yes.
But if you ask the opposite question, you could just do chapter and verse. Pick the state, pick the year. I mean, there are more than 16 million people who have concealed carry permits in this country. They care about it. It's an issue.
Well, and theoretically,
I got to run. But down the road, does something happen legislatively with Trump pushing it?
I think something happens, but it's modest. It's
I'm very skeptical that anything happens.
Modest.
Modest. Okay. Panel, thank you. Final thoughts on the Reverend Billy Graham, his life and legacy when we return.
The world's largest investment bank purchased $300 million of gold for their own account. What?
This morning, at the age of 99. He was referred to as America's pastor, a president's preacher. Before I toss to my colleague and friend Martha McCallum in New York, I'd like to say thanks for inviting us into your home tonight for this special report, Fair, Balanced, and Unafraid, the Reverend Billy Graham, a life and legacy that will always be remembered.
There are two roads. There's the broad road that leads to destruction and judgment, and there's the other road that leads to heaven.
There are problems of sin and habit that cannot be solved outside the person of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Martha McCallum, and this is The Story. In a moment when the nation is struggling with violence and divisiveness, two important things happened today that make us stop and think about where we're headed as a nation. The first, listening at the White House.
Should have been one school shooting, and we should have fixed it. And I'm pissed, because my daughter I'm not going to see again. She's not here. Never, ever will I see my kid. That's how I want it to sink in. It's eternity. My beautiful daughter I'm never going to see again.
I was on the second floor in that building, texting my mom, texting my dad, texting three of my brothers, that I was never going to see him again. And then it occurred to me that my 14-year-old brother was directly above me in that classroom where Scott Beagle was murdered. And now, I don't know how I'm ever going to step foot on that place again, or go to a public park after school, or be walking anywhere. Me and my friends, we get scared when a car drives by. I turned 18 the day after. Woke up to the news that my best friend was gone. And I don't understand why I could still go in a store and buy a weapon of war. How is it that easy to buy this type of weapon? How are we not stop this after Columbine, after Sandy? I'm sitting with a mother that lost her son. It's still happening.
This is my son, Daniel. He was 7 years old when he was shot to death in his first grade classroom in Sandy Hook Elementary School, just a little over 5 years ago.
I'm only 15 years old. I'm a sophomore. 19 years ago, the first school shooting at Columbine High School happened. And I was born into a world where I never got to experience safety and peace.
Justin was texting me, hiding in a closet, saying, if something happens, I love you. If something happens, I love you. And you can't imagine what that's like as a parent. If he's not old enough to buy a drink, to go and buy a beer, he should not be able to buy a gun at 18 years old. I mean, that's just common sense. We have to do common sense. Please, Mr. Trump.
I'm not here to debate, but I lost my sister. And like Mr. President said, if you could find 20% of maybe retired law enforcement officers or teachers who could go through discrete training to carry a firearm on this waist, it could have been a very different situation.
Rather than arm them with a firearm, I would rather arm them with the knowledge of how to prevent these acts from happening in the first place. And I urge you, please stay focused on that as well. It is the gun, it's the person behind the gun, and it's about helping people before they ever reach that point.
And on the same day, when we heard all of that, the death of at the age of 99, of the Reverend Billy Graham. 4 years ago, at 95, Graham expressed his deep concern about what was happening in our country.
At the age of 99.
Times a lot of weapons. As I've gone from city to city, and I've seen how far people have wandered from God. With all my heart, I want to leave you with my church.
In an interview that year, he said this: "We've been going down the wrong road for a long time. Seemingly, man has learned to live without God. He lives in a world dangerously torn by hate and violence and conflict, and yet he feels powerless to do anything about them." Billy Graham preached about love and hope during some of our nation's darkest hours, including the days after September 11th.
A tragedy like this could have torn our country apart, but instead, it has united us. There's hope for the present because I believe the stage has already been set for a new spirit in our nation.
And so tonight, as a nation, we take stock with a deeply moving conversation at the White House and a call to action. And we will talk to two people who knew and worked with Reverend